We're going to talk about improving website performance and scalability while also saving money. You can see my Twitter handle, my email address. Feel free to email me when this is done if you have any question. My blog address. I am providing these slides, and I have two versions of the website. We're going to review a before and after that will be linked on the website for you to use as well, so all this code will be available to you. We'll skip this because we went through that already. We'll talk about performance rules just to kind of set the baseline of how things should work. And Richard Campbell is half of .NET Rocks and one of the founders of Strange Loop Networks. And I saw one of his performance talks, and I love this quote: "Performance is like air, no one cares about it until there isn't any," which is very true. So I've been doing a lot of performance work lately, and one of the things that surprised me as being a web developer is I always was focusing on server side and how do I write better code to make things faster. So I got a book from Steve Souders called High Performance Websites, and reading through that and some of the research, it was obvious that for most websites, only about 10 to 20% of the time is your client actually waiting for your HTML document. What they're mostly waiting for these days are all of your JavaScript, CSS, and images that you have on your site. So there's really three high-level performance rules we're going to focus on that carry throughout the talk. So the idea is you want to make fewer HTTP requests. So in other words, let's not ask for as many images, JavaScript, and style sheets. You want to send as little data as possible. So the smaller we can make these images and other things, the faster it'll be to get to the client. And also send it as infrequently as possible. So only send it to them when we actually need to do an update. So those are the high-level rules we want to focus on. How do you save money with this approach? Well, I'm going to show you examples that are going to let you use a lot less bandwidth than you use today. Potentially use less servers because we're going to reduce load on your servers. As far as making money, I put a reference there to some research that having better performance actually increases your sales and your traffic. So there's an example of Amazon. For every 100 millisecond increase in load time, they actually lose 1% of their sales, and some more info on Google Maps. The other thing is Google and other search engines are starting to use performance to help determine ranking. So if your site performs better, you're going to get a higher ranking, which will drive more traffic. So that's kind of the angle of performance is nice, my clients will be happy, but I'm going to be happy as well because I'm going to save money. I want to start really quickly with we're going to walk through doing some tracing. So I wanted people just to understand that the conversation going on between your browser and your server is using HTTP. And as you see, it's been around a long time, since about 1997. The important couple things about it, it's a request and a response paradigm. So your client browser is going to send a request for a particular file, and it's going to get back that complete response. It's text-based, which is going to be very helpful for us because it's easy for us to trace and watch these conversations. I gave you a link to where the RFC is. I found it particularly useful when I look at caching and some other specifics to go back to the actual RFC and see what should the rules be, how should this behave. We'll talk first about, I think from a performance standpoint, where you have to start is measuring to see where do I have a performance problem. In other words, don't just go start making changes because you think this might be better. I always want to start with some measurements so I have an idea of what was it like before, what specifically is my problem that I'm having, and then I like to capture when I'm done so I can compare the two of them. So Fiddler is a nice tool from a Microsoft employee. It's actually free, and I gave you a URL at the bottom where you can download it. It's a tracing tool meant specifically for HTTP traffic. So when we look at it, it's only meant to watch web conversations, and it makes that very easy. The other good thing about it is it's going to show a complete request and response together. It's not going to show all the individual packets back and forth. So it's very easy to see this is what was sent, and here's everything that came back. You can save an archive of a session, so I do this all the time with performance. I get the before picture and the after picture, and I'll save them. So a year from now I can come back and say, that's how it used to behave when we did it the old way, and this is what we did for improvement. We'll talk a little bit about using it on your own machine. I'll show you in a demo here in a minute. The other thing I find interesting is the transfer timeline. So they've got a graph. Once I go to a website, I can actually click on the transfer timeline, and it's going to show me exactly which components were part of this request. So here's a quick picture. I go out to a particular site, and you can see it's downloading images, it's downloading JavaScript files. This is nice to talk to people when you're at a design point for a website. You can go and say, you know, this is why if we look through here, there's a couple JPEGs in the middle that are taking most of the time. So that will give me an idea. I should look at those and see if I should optimize those or not. So let me show you a quick Fiddler demonstration. So all I need to do is I'll start up Fiddler, and we'll go look at a page that I actually have on my own machine. So when I develop, I actually am both the client and the server at the same time. So I'm running IIS here on my machine, and I've got a particular page I'm going to look at, the home page here. So let's pull this up and see how this looks. So I've got a pretty standard page, a header, it's got an image, and if I go back into Fiddler, I can see the requests that were made. So I can see here I went and asked for the home page, so you can see the request for default ASPX. You'll then see I'm looking for the jQuery files, some CS files, JavaScript files, etc. And with Fiddler, then the thing that I like, I can come across and go and look at a timeline view. These all look really nice at the moment because I'm local to the same machine, but when I do this testing against a production machine somewhere else on the internet, some of these get very large, so I can see where I'm spending a lot of the time. But the idea is I can come back and look at a particular request, and because this is text-based, I can look at what was sent to the server and what came back. So I find this useful for doing a lot of troubleshooting, but again, from a performance standpoint, the main idea is I want to look at the timeline. I can also look across here at some of the sizes of the files. You can see here how big these pages were when they were requested. So that's the idea with Fiddler. Another tool that I use a lot of the time is Microsoft Network Monitor. I'm not real particular, by the way, that you use this particular tool. I'm trying to show you that this is an idea of tools. If you're not familiar with this kind of tool, here's one of them. There's a lot of competitors to Network Monitor, your Wiresharks, etc. The idea is that you just know how to use one. So the nice thing about Network Monitor, it's from Microsoft, it's free. It traces all sorts of different levels, and it does it at the packet level. So when we start talking about compression and other things, I want to be able to show you requests that come in packet by packet, so I can show you what the difference looks like. So let's pull this one up. I can just kick off Network Monitor. So what I'll do is I can come in and say I want to do a new capture. I can say start, and then I can go out and make requests. So when I go browse now in my Internet Explorer, it's going to keep a list of all the packets that were requested. Now I want to show you one that I've already done. I've got a big page on this machine. So I saved off this particular request, and when you go look, you can see I made a request for large grid view.aspx. The next packet down was where the response started, and then all these packets that are underneath it are all the conversations that had to happen between your browser at your client's machine all the way back to your server just to get that one page. So if I scroll down here, you'll see it took about 40 packets or so. So this will become important later when I show you how compression works. I'm going to show you the difference when we turn compression on. But again, it's another free tool. I use this one when I want to see the packet level and see what's actually going on for the conversation. So again, the key thing for me is measuring. So when we start talking about performance, I don't want to be in just making random changes to my code base without knowing it's going to have the biggest impact on my customers. So one of the things I use is IIS has log files. So your web server is saving off logs of all the requests. One of the fields you can put in there is called time taken. It's the time that it takes to actually execute the request on the server and how long it takes to go to the client. So you can use another free Microsoft tool called Log Parser. What Log Parser lets you do is you can write actual SQL queries against your log file. So what I do is I take my production web server logs every day, I copy them over to another machine. I've got a series of Log Parser queries I'll run against it that tell me what was the largest pages I was serving and which pages took the most time to render. So from a performance standpoint, which ones took a long time to execute and get to the client, so I can spend some time focusing on those. There's also a lot of third-party services. So if you're familiar with Keynote or Gomez are good examples. The idea is these are services you can pay. They have servers set up all across the United States and all across the world, and they will monitor your website every 10 or 15 minutes, and they'll give you performance metrics. So what I can do is I can see when I make a performance change, I can actually check out Keynote or Gomez, and it'll give me an exact measurement of what I did affected customers in this way. So that's very helpful for me to see that the changes I'm making actually have an impact on my clients. So let's start talking about some of the best techniques. First one is HTTP compression. So the idea is if your browser handles compression, which 90+% of browsers are handling it today, they will send to the server and say accept encoding gzip when they make the request to the server. That tells the server that it can compress this content. In other words, if you're familiar with how zip works, it's basically taking that file and making it a lot smaller and send that smaller file down. So we did this quite a while ago on our website. We ended up saving about 50% of our bandwidth, and it actually got faster for our customers by about 25%. The good news is compression is built into IIS, so if you're doing an ASP.NET site using IIS, this is something you get for free. In IIS 7, this is actually on by default for static files. So the good news is your JavaScript, your CSS, all those types of files are automatically being compressed. It won't compress your images because that doesn't help, and it does not do your dynamic files. You have to actually go in and turn that on. I actually turn on dynamic files as well, so all of my ASP.NET pages that get created get compressed before they're sent down to the client. Again, the benefits of this, it's free, it saves me a lot of bandwidth, and it's also faster for my customers. So the only reason that you really wouldn't use compression would be CPU usage. So there's an argument that CPU, this is like a 2 to 5% impact. Obviously you need to test this on your own systems to see what kind of impact you'd have. But the idea would be if CPU were really high, that's the only reason you wouldn't use compression. And my argument is if your CPU is that high on your web servers, you've got other problems. So I mean, you've got to get a web farm and get that distributed better. So I see no reason why you wouldn't want to turn on compression. And what I see in general, about 90+% of the requests that come into my server are actually sent back compressed. And again, at the very bottom, I've got a link. If you're using IIS 6, you're able to turn this on. You just have to do a few more steps. So I've got a link on there on how you would do that. So let's go back and we'll pull up the network trace and show you the difference between, you saw the first request we made. I'm going to show you what this looks like after you have compression turned on. So you can see I've got the same request that I made before and the response coming back from the server, but instead of taking 41 packets, so 41 conversations between my client and server, I'm down to about 6 or 7. So you can see why it makes a big difference when you have compression turned on. So that's a very obvious and easy thing you can do for performance. Another one is content expirations. So the idea is by default, somebody comes to my website, they've never been here before. They're going to get my home page, they're going to get all my images, style sheets, JavaScript. By default, your browser is going to store it in a local cache on their machine. They close their browser, let's say they come back 2 days later. What I'd like to have happen, and what you might assume would happen, is the browser would look in its cache and see all of these files and just use them. Unfortunately, that isn't what it does by default. What the browser does by default is it looks and says, it goes and gets your home page. If you haven't made any changes, it says, okay, I need all these images, JavaScript, CSS. It sees them all in its cache, but it's not sure if you've updated them on the server yet or not. So what they do is they actually, file by file, say, I'm going to go back to your web server and ask if this content has been modified. The bad news is, if it's a small file, that conversation can be just as expensive as the original request. So what I want to do instead is I want to really leverage that user's browser cache. It's never going to be faster for them than giving them the files they need already on their own hard disk. The way you do that is you set up expiration times for your folders. So I separate all my content for JavaScript out to its own folder, CSS goes in its own folder, and images. And in images, for instance, I can say, you know, my images don't change that often. I'm going to set a 30-day or 90-day expiration on this complete folder. Now what will happen is, as people come back, it'll look and it'll actually say in the cache, I got this file 3 days ago, it's good for 30 days, I'm not even going to go talk to the server. So if you think about, my home page used to be a single request for the HTML and maybe 90+ requests for all the jQuery plugins, CSS, and images. If I can use expirations, I can get it to go from nearly 100 requests down to a single request. The reaction I get to this usually is, well, what if I need to change one of those files? How do I do that? And the trick for that is you rename the file. So if you watch how jQuery plugins have the version number embedded right in the name, they do that so you can set an expiration. When you get a new version of jQuery, it's going to have a new file name because it's got a new version number. When the browser client comes back, it'll get your home page. It'll see, oh, he's now using the new version of jQuery. It'll look in its cache. That's not going to be there. The old version is there. That's fine. It's trying to get a new one. It'll come back to my server and get that. So I get the best of both worlds. And again, this is tremendously reducing load on my web servers because all of the files that I set up with expirations don't need to be requested anymore. How you set this up in IIS 7, you can go to a particular folder like your images folder. If you go to the HTTP response headers in the IIS manager, I gave a little screenshot here, you can go click on the expire web content and go to the after and say I want to expire all the content in this folder 30 days or 90 days or however far out you want, and then people who get those won't have to come back to your server again. So again, it's just a big savings on requests made back to your particular machine. Talking about some of the other things we're going to get into, we really have to set it up correctly. So the idea with CSS and JavaScript is I want this stuff to be external, not in my HTML files. So not in any of my markup. I want to move all this stuff out to separate files, and here's why. First of all, it's going to reduce my page size. It allows me to reuse. If I'm embedding styles in JavaScript directly in a page, there's no way that another page could take advantage of that. By pulling it out into a separate file, I can reuse that same style or JavaScript on another page. And once I split it out, now I'm able to use expirations because maybe my page will change, but my styles in JavaScript will remain the same. So I can put expirations on those in the future. And I'll talk a little bit about this later when we talk about consolidation. But the idea is set yourself up to be able to do this stuff correctly. Get your CSS and your JavaScript out of your markup into separate files. And that will set us up to do everything else we want to do from a performance standpoint. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I left this in here just to give you an idea. If you're using IIS 6, this was a bit of a surprise for me. So the idea was, we talked about how caching worked before and how expirations worked. Years back, somebody said, we want a better mechanism than, when your browser was looking into the cache to see if a file has been modified, it was using a timestamp to go back to the server and say, has this been modified since this date? They were concerned about date-time differences. They said, let's create this ETag idea. So the issue with it is, this is part of a response header. It's going to send back an ETag. So in IIS, it's going to send some hash of your file and a change number. The problem on IIS 6 is that change number is specific to the web server you're on. So let's walk through a scenario here. Somebody comes to my site, they get the content down in their cache, they come back later, either it's expired or maybe I don't have expirations, they come back to my server and say, here's the ETag I had, has this been changed? Well, the issue is because I've got a production web farm with a bunch of web servers in it, the likelihood that you're going to come back to the same server that you came to last time is pretty low. So when you come back to a new server, I'm saying, hey, here's my file, here's the hash, here's my change number. That change number part is not going to match. So it's going to force them to re-download all of these files, even though maybe none of them have been modified. So if you're in IIS 6, there's a way to set this. You can email me if you have this situation. I'll show you how you can set this. Your other choice, in IIS 7, they looked and said, we're just going to make this 0 by default. In other words, the change number will be 0. So if we use ETags, you don't have to worry about this coming back to a different server problem. The other thing that's cool in IIS 7, I can actually write an HTTP module that will completely remove this ETag on the response that goes out to the client. So let me just show you a quick Fiddler trace so we can see what that looks like. So I made a request. We'll come back and take a look at that. In the response here, you'll see that there's going to be an ETag. I don't see it on mine at the moment. So let me skip past this. For now, we'll say normally there'd be an ETag that shows up in this response, and there's a way in IIS 7, and I've included the code for you in the performance after. So I've got I talked about two different Visual Studio projects. In the one performance after, I've actually got code in here that shows you how you can take this out. So every time, if you've seen modules before, I'm implementing an HTTP module. Every time the end request event fires for any request that comes into IIS 7, I can just go remove that ETags, so I must have this enabled right now. You can go in your web config. So you can walk through this example with the performance after project that I'm going to give you, and that will actually take ETags out. Effectively, ETags were an idea that they had to make things better that really never panned out. So from an IS7 standpoint, I'd rather just completely get rid of them. But either way, so if you're in IS6, just be aware you got to do a little work there because it's not going to behave how you'd expect. Another big win for performance around JavaScript and CSS. So we talked about general performance rules. I don't want to make as many requests between my client and my server. That just takes a lot of time. So I want to do two things with my CSS and JavaScript files. First thing I want to do is I want to minimize them. So if you're familiar, if you use jQuery, a lot of people do, or other jQuery plugins or JavaScript libraries, you'll see they often have a .min version. If we go look at what that looks like, these minimized versions, I'll go show you the JavaScript for this. You'll notice all of the white space is gone. They've removed all the comments and all the white space. So they've minimized and essentially done some compression on this file to make it smaller. So that's the first thing we want to do. We want to get all of our JavaScript and CSS to be minimized so we can get rid of things we don't need. What I found, Microsoft has another free tool called Ajax Minifier, and you can get it on Codeplex. It has a command line interface, a DLL, some build tasks. I set it up that I use the MS build task. So every time we build a website in release mode, we will actually kick off an Ajax Minifier task that will take all of the JavaScript files and CSS files that have not already been minified. It will minify them, and I gave you an example here of jQuery from the original to the minimized. You save about 55% of its size. So what you do is it'll minimize all of these. And then the next step I took was, well, not only do I want them to be as small as they can be, I still had 15 JavaScript files. So my browser was talking back and forth to my server 15 times. I used a build task that took all 15 of those JavaScript files and combined them into a single file. So now what happens is when you come to my website, not only have I minimized the JavaScript as much as I can, I'm going to compress it some more, which will still make it smaller. I'm going to consolidate it so instead of being 15 files, there's only one. And the same for CSS. So effectively on our website, you went from 10 or 15 JavaScript, 10 or so CSS to just 2 files. And I've got an article, if you go out to ASP Alliance/1992, I've got a detailed walkthrough of exactly how you do this. But effectively, it took a few hours to set up and get configured. Every time we build in release mode, it automatically does this minification and references these files. It uses version numbers automatically on these files, so I can put them in a folder where I can set an expiration for a year. So now what will happen, you come to my website, you're going to get a single JavaScript, a single CSS, and I'm going to tell your browser cache, keep these for a year. So every time you revisit for the next year, as long as I haven't changed anything in these files, you won't have to come back and get these files from me. And this alone saved roughly 50% of our homepage time. So it's that much faster for clients because they're making that many less requests back and forth. So that's a real huge advantage. Again, this was all with free things that you can use from Microsoft and using MS Build.
Hey, Robert.
Yes.
There's a question from Matt. In YSlow, it gives you low marks if you don't have ETags, but you're saying to not use them. Why are you saying that?
Well, when you go into YSlow and you talk, if you read through the high performance, so Steve Sodders is the guy from Yahoo. The book I referenced earlier is the guy who worked at Yahoo who wrote YSlow. If you go into the details about what he says about ETags, he basically says you'd rather not have them. So when he wrote, and you can go into the details in there, but when he wrote that, and when they wrote YSlow, they were hoping that you at least had the right kind of settings for ETags. I think the end result of his, and I'm not going to get into it right now, but he's got on page 95 of his reconfigure or remove ETags. That's his recommendation. So if you take them off, that's actually going to be better. Your response is going to be smaller. You might get dinged if the current version of YSlow is not up to date as far as recognizing that you just took them out. And I guess from my seat, I'm going to be happier with the performance benefits I get from taking it out, having a smaller response. And I would just explain that to whoever I'm giving my YSlow number to and say, I'm aware of that, and here's the reference on why I would take that out. So I still argue, get rid of it. I think you're better off. Even though YSlow may not be up to speed on taking it off, is better than having it configured correctly. Okay?
Great, thanks.
Yep. So another one, so now we talked about consolidating and minifying JavaScript and CSS. So now effectively, you can take your website and you can get it down to your actual HTML page. You can get all of your JavaScript in one file, all of your CSS in one file. Then you turn around and look, and the next big batch of things that are going to still be requested are your images. So the idea with CSS sprites is, let's take all of these, and I do it for small images personally. I'm going to take all these small images on my site that do borders and other things that affect how my design looks. I want to take all of those and put them into a single image, and then use CSS to index into this larger image rather than have all these small images. So again, on my home page, I maybe had 50 images before, took about 25 of them, shoved those 25 because they were small and good candidates for sprites because they're borders and things that I'm not probably going to change until I actually redesign my entire site. Take those and put them all into a single image, and now I've cut 24 more image requests off what the browser has to ask my server for. So a lot of people do this. If you do the Fiddler trace, you look at the Googles and Yahoos and other sites, you'll see occasionally you'll see an image that's made up of a whole bunch of other images that you see on the site, and that's this technique. So again, we're trying to reduce the number of requests. There's lots of ways to make sprites. I gave one example here. If you look at your site and you've got a bunch of images you want to put into a sprite, you can put them into a zip file. You can go to this website. What it will do is it'll combine all of your images into a single image. It'll also spit out all the CSS you need to be able to reference those images correctly. So I'll show you this example, and then I just wanted to mention Microsoft's actually working right now, the ASP.NET team on CodePlex has a image optimization preview number 3. What they're going to try to do is they're going to try to let you avoid doing some of this work. You can just specify a folder that has all the images you want to go into a sprite, and at runtime they're going to do the creation for you and all the work you need to change your images into the proper sprites. So going forward, I'm very interested in how is this going to work out with Microsoft. Take advantage of this tool. At this point, I'm going to show you the example of what I've got right now until that actually gets released. So let's look at the before and the after. So I've got a page. Let's just pull this up in the browser. So I scroll down and you'll see I've got the Facebook, Twitter, and email. If I go look at what this page looks like and how I created it, that's going to be a pretty standard set of image tags. So if you see, I've just got my Facebook image, I've got my Twitter image, I've got my email. The idea with the sprite now, if I pull up the after, I took those 3 images, I went to that site, I put them into a zip file, I uploaded them, I got back from that site this image, and if you look, it's really a single image made up of those individual images, and they leave a little extra space in there just in case your CSS stuff is not as precise. They also gave me back all the CSS I need, so if I go down to what the page looks like now, there's different ways to do this. I choose to do this with a span. So instead of being an image tag, I put in a span tag, and I reference the class sprite Facebook. If I roll up here, that I'm going to have that in my style sheet. So I've got a reference to my style sheet up top here. Let's go look at what that looks like. So in here, this is what I also got back from that site. They said anytime you want to use the Facebook image, just reference this class. And here's what they gave me back. And all this is doing is it's saying, hey, you can find Facebook at this offset within that image. So you can see it's using some offsets and some windowing to show me that particular image. So if I go pull this up in a browser, and we'll see that visually it looks the same, but now instead of making 3 requests for separate images, I've just made a single request. So again, if you can go through your site, find small images that you can combine, you can just reduce the number of requests that your client has to make back to your server again. So that's another technique that's good from an image standpoint. The only warning I'll say on this one is that depending on how you implement, the way I implemented it, these are now spans using backgrounds in CSS. So if somebody were to print this page before, when they were actually images, these images would show up. If I go print now that they're sprites and I'm using background positions, by default, this background, browsers don't print background images. So just be aware that that's one side effect of this technique. The other thing I don't care for, that I prefer not to have to do, is I'd really rather not have to change them into a completely different tag. That's why I'm looking forward to this Microsoft at runtime will change your images. I'm kind of following that to see how will that work out and how will that help me make sprites without having to do some of this manual work. But again, it's just a way to reduce some of your traffic to your server. Next thing to talk about is images. So the most important thing with images is to focus on using the right format for the right type of image. So a common mistake is people will take photos and save them as a GIF. And the issue with that is the way that GIF and JPEG have their compression, they're both better at different things. So JPEGs are what I want to use for photos. There are really two versions of PNGs, but in general I use the JPEGs for photos. The nice thing about JPEGs is I can compress them. So when I look at an image I want to put on a website, I can trade off the size versus the quality. In other words, I can play with compression numbers until I get to the point where I can see a good trade-off. So what I do, I've got an example, and this is something I do often. I went out and took a single image, so let me pull up how the page looks first. So if we look at the particular page, I've got all sorts of different versions of compression, and I've kind of mixed them up because I like to show to people that it's often not obvious which ones are compressed. Now if you see the one I'm hovering over, that's too much compression. I mean, you can see the pixelation here. That would be a mistake. I don't want to go that far. If I come back over here, so this is really the starting image. It's 0% compression. It's 172K. Now as I look around here, I can look at some of these other versions. So if you look at this one is 25% compression. It's gone from 172K down to 31K. So it's about 20% the size of the original. And side by side, it's even hard to tell. And you can do this on your own machine. Compare the two and see, can you see enough visual artifacts to not make that worthwhile? If you think this is still not as good a quality, you could back off and do something like this one. Let's just do 10% of the compression. We only get down to 47K. That's still a third of the original size. So one of the common mistakes, you can go to a lot of websites where they have not done any optimization at all. And as you can see, just by doing Paint Shop Pro I've used, you can use Photoshop. Virtually all the major image editing software will let you save a JPEG at a given compression level. So all you do is take the original and play with this back and forth until you get to the point that you're not losing quality, but you're making it a lot smaller. So you can see I would probably go with these two potentially. I've already got it to be at 47K. That's more than a third less. So I've cut 2/3 off the size of that, really not giving up much visual quality. And then I'll just put that out on my site, and I've got that much less bandwidth, that much less load, and it's going to be that much faster for my customers to get those images downloaded. A couple other things you can do. There are image optimizers. So the first one I've used, JPEG Tran. The idea is even after I've done compression, there's a lot of metadata that gets stuffed into image files, copyrights, things like that. This tool will actually let me go remove that metadata in a lossless way. In other words, everything that tool does will take and make your file smaller, but it'll do it in such a way that it doesn't affect any of your quality. It's just stuff you don't need. So if I go back to that page example again, you'll see with these two, both of them have 10% compression. But running JPEG Tran, I've got this one in the middle to be down to 32K instead of 47K. And their image quality is exactly the same. So what I like to do is do the optimization of the image, then run it through this utility to take out the metadata I don't need. And I've gone from now 172K down to 32K, which is a huge improvement. And again, it's just going to save me money, be faster for my customers, and not give up any quality. Another thing to watch out for, if you've ever looked at your log files, you'll see there's all these requests for favicon.ico. So what that is, if I go back to my browser here, I can create an icon that fills, if you see where I'm hovering here next to the address bar, I can put a custom icon there. The problem is that by default, every time somebody comes to your site, they're going to request that favorite icon, and I wanted to find a way to actually cache that. So if you look at this example, there's actually a link tag, so I can put a link tag and call it my shortcut icon. I can reference then my icon file from any folder I want. So I purposely put this in my images folder, knowing that now it's going to take advantage of the same expirations and caching advantages as any other image would. So that allowed me to move it out of my root folder, and now if you come to my site for 30 days, you won't be hitting me. So 29 times you would have been asking me for this file won't happen in the next month if you came back every day. So again, it's just a way to reduce some load, take advantage of caching, and it's just that easy. I reference it using, and I can name it however I want. So that's kind of a cool feature with caching your icons. Next thing we'll talk about quickly is content distribution networks. So the idea with these is you want to be able to distribute some of your content in a way that it's closer to your customers. So if you think about one of my customers comes to my site, they got to get my homepage, they have to come all the way back to my server to get images, etc. The idea with these CDN networks is they've set up servers all over the United States, all over the world, that are attached to different ISPs. So the idea is that they have a server that's going to be much closer to my end customer than my web server is. So I've used these for images in the past. What will happen is somebody will come, they'll reference a DNS name that points to a CDN. It'll come out to the CDN, it'll say, oh, this is the closest server. If that server already has my images because somebody else has been to my site, it'll serve it directly from that local server. So it's that much closer to the customer, it's going to be that much faster, and I don't have any of the bandwidth being taken from my main website. So the advantage, there's lots of them. Akamai has been one of the early leaders, Limelight, Internet. You can set up with these. These are not free. I mean, these are services you have to pay for. But if it's important for you to get some performance benefit, and in my case, before, I wanted to offload some of the bandwidth from my website, so I took advantage of a CDN with images. So all the images are served from somewhere else. So I got the speed advantage, and I don't have to deal with all the bandwidth load. If you've used jQuery, jQuery is set up in such a way that both jQuery.com, Microsoft, and Google will host jQuery library files for you for free. So I'm going to show you an example of how to use that. So here's the CDN. So if you look at the example here, I've got different JavaScript links. So the first one says, please pull jQuery off of jQuery.com. The next one would be off Google. I'm pulling this one actually from Microsoft's site. So if I were to pull this up, it's just going to pop up and say ready function. So if I go back, you'll see it fired. So I know that jQuery got loaded effectively. In this case, it got loaded from Microsoft rather than my server. So I don't need to use my bandwidth and have hits against my machine. Microsoft is willing to host this for me. The other advantage is if a couple sites use Microsoft and your customer has already been to the Microsoft site to pull that file, it'll already be in their cache. So when they come back and see, hey, please go to Microsoft and get this jQuery file, it'll notice it already has it cached and it won't even have to go get it. So it's another advantage of CDNs. My personal opinion on the jQuery in particular, I chose not to use a CDN. When I did my architecture review, that's one more single point of failure that I don't want to have to worry about. If you're familiar with the recent Amazon issues, I know these are big vendors, but I'm already keeping my server up and running. With compression and minification and consolidation, I roll my jQuery file into that one big JavaScript file, and I know that I'm going to be able to serve that from my site. I choose not to take that single point of failure, and I just serve the jQuery from my own folder. But if it makes sense for you, that's something you can take advantage of. CDNs in general are useful for static files, so any of your images, CSS, JavaScript, if you're interested in it, it's a way to get better performance and reduce some load on your servers. So that is CDNs. Talk briefly about data caching. So everything we've talked about so far has been more, you can take advantages on any website. It's not been really getting into coding. Here I'm going to talk a little bit more about the coding idea. So we've had our site around for a long time. We were an ASP site. When we went to .NET, we realized that ASP.NET had this cache object. So that we looked at our product detail page and said, you know, on product details, every time you look at a product detail, I'm going all the way to SQL Server to get the data for this product detail. These are things that don't change very often. Why don't I just take my product data and my category data and put them in the local cache on the web server in memory? And then when we go to see product details, I'll pull it out of the cache instead of going to SQL Server. And then I'll just drop that cache every night at 3 a.m. And then at 3 a.m. when it's gone, I'll re-request the data. So by doing this, we actually cut 50% of all of our SQL Server queries went away. So 73 million less queries go against my SQL Server by caching just those two things. And so not only, you know, that's a scalability advantage, I've got half of my SQL Server usage went away, so now I can use more of that for other purposes. I get better performance because I don't need to go off box when I go to a product detail page. All that stuff's going to be local right on the web server. And it's also more reliable because if SQL Server happened to die in the middle of the day, I don't care from this page's perspective because this page doesn't need to go out to SQL Server to get its data. And I've got an article, if you go to ASP Alliance, that walks through kind of how you do this in particular. I wanted to show you one other feature that's kind of cool called substitution caching. So one of the problems in the past, you can use output caching in ASP.NET. So you can basically say, I've got a page, and I'll just show you what the page will look like. I've got a page on it, and you know, this stuff doesn't change. Why don't I cache the output of this? So you can actually come and say, I want to output cache this page for 60 seconds. So if anybody else comes back and looks for it, they'll be able to see the same thing out of memory. And if you follow how this works, and there's some good articles on this, you can really increase your scalability because you don't have to re-execute this page every time. The issue would be, let's say there's part of the page where I need to actually be able to get it live. So for instance, maybe I'm a show and I'm selling these out and I want to see the quantity get reduced. So I can't cache that part. ASP.NET has this substitution caching. So I can tell it, yes, I want to cache the entire page, but this little part I actually have to go do live. So I can go look in the back end here and you'll see a get quantity. This will actually get fired every time. So if I come back and if you watch, the time on the top here will change this first time, and then as I keep hitting refresh, I'm caching that for 60 seconds, but if you look down below, you can see that I'm not caching that. So I get the advantage of output caching, but I can still deal with pages that are mostly shared, but maybe there's a little bit that's personalized for this customer, or maybe has to be driven from the database, so I get kind of the best of both worlds with substitution caching. Talk a little bit about server-side view state. So if you're familiar with view state, if you're a web forms programmer, it takes all this view state and shoves it into a hidden client field. So when you go to your ASPX page, all of this view state gets bundled up, stuck in a hidden field, and sent down to the client. Well, the idea with this is we were having some issues with when we went from ASP to ASP.NET, where some devices can only have a hidden field of a certain size. So they'd actually cut it off. So when they resubmitted to me, I'd get a view state's invalid because part of the view state was missing. So we actually wrote code to move the view state out of the client hidden field and put it into session memory on my web server. They've since added this as default support in ASP.NET, so you can actually go do this on your own. So I wanted to show people, if you happen to have view state issues, it's worth the trade-off for me to shove that view state into my web server memory, which is relatively cheap, and avoid all the download time to the client. So it's faster and it's a lot smaller, and you can control it in your web config using the session page state. So I'll show you how to do this quickly. So let's look at it before and after. So I've got a page here that's got an incredibly large view state. If I open this up, you'll see the view state here just goes on and on and on. Well, what I do with this is using a technique called adapters. So you need an app browsers folder, and I've got an article if you want to see this on ASP Alliance as well and on my blog. But if you go in here, I can say I'll just change this. So for every browser, I want to, every time you're about to fire a page, you're going to create a system web UI page object. I want you to use my adapter called server-side view state. In that adapter, what I need to do is actually just say, when they ask for a page, a get state persister, return the built-in session one instead of the hidden one. So now that I've done this, we'll go back and run that page again. And if I do a view source, you'll see it leaves a little key information so it can index into your server-side memory, but all that view state went away. So now my client exposure of view state is very small, so you're going to get some performance benefits out of that. Again, in your environment, you're going to have to stress test, do some performance testing, and say, do I really want to move this into my web server memory? Is it worth it for me? We basically had to do it because we were having issues. I mean, devices were cutting off our view state and people couldn't order. At this point, we're using it for performance benefit. If you notice in web config, there's a history size. What that's there for is people can go back in their browser. So if you only kept one version of view state in your server and they went back a page and tried to submit, it would die. So you have to keep a couple versions of view state around. I happen to use 5. I've used it for a long time. So people on my site can go backwards 5 times and hit submit, which just is not a normal use case. So I'm keeping the last 5 copies of view state in memory. So that's what that setting is for. Talk about Ajax quickly from a performance standpoint. So people are familiar with Ajax. There's a lot of reasons you don't want to have the whole page flash. You can also take advantage of Ajax from a performance standpoint. So instead of going back to the server, re-executing an entire page, bringing it all back to the client, you can use jQuery is what I happen to use. You have other techniques, but I can make a callback to get really specific pieces of data. Sometimes that's a big performance advantage if there's a small amount of data you need on a large page. So there's really 2 ways to do it in jQuery. The first one is if you call the .load method. If you're just calling your server and you're getting back a fragment of HTML and you're just going to shove it in somewhere on your page, it doesn't get any easier than load, and I'll show you that. I tend to always use .ajax. Because I want to control timeouts and what happens if an error occurs. So let's take a look at how this looks. So I've got a page here. If I pull this up, I'm going to hit this button. It's going to make a call to the server, and it just gets back HTML. The other one, I'm going to make it the .ajax call and get some JSON back. So let's look at how this code looks. So again, when it comes to the HTML, this is how easy it is. I use jQuery and I say, when you call this function, I want you to find this div, which is down below, content area. I want you to make a call to the server, and in this case I'm just calling an ASHX handler on the server. Make a call to that, get the HTML back, shove it into that div. That's all I need to do. I've done an Ajax call and gotten it back. The other, in this case, I'm doing something more sophisticated. I'll call .ajax. I'll point it at another handler. I can specify timeouts, I can specify whether I want to cache it or not, and since I'm getting JSON data back, I can actually treat it like a JavaScript object when I get it back on the client. So again, I can take advantage of, rather than a whole page post back, if I only need a little bit of data, I can just make this quick call. It's going to be a lot less data transferred back and forth, and on the server side, if you've done handlers before, and we'll just look at the HTML to make it easy. Handlers don't go through the whole pipeline you normally do for ASP.NET. You don't have the page load, the init, all that overhead, creating the control tree. All you're going to do is fire a function. Obviously, I've got this hard-coded here. I can make database calls, whatever I need to do to get that HTML, and just return it. So this is a very lightweight server, and the jQuery in the client makes it very easy to just make an Ajax call and get some data back. Quickly talk about some tools. We had a question on this earlier, so I'm glad you brought it up. Some good performance analysis tools. I talked about the book by Steve Souders. He took those 14 tips he has in there and implemented them into YSlow, and a lot of the same tips have been put in Google PageSpeed. The idea with these tools is you can go run them against your website, and it'll give you a quick rundown of, what do you have wrong? I mean, what should you focus on from a performance standpoint? So let's go look at one of these. These are Firefox plugins. So I'm going to go out here and pull up Firefox, and I've got I'm going to show my Firebug looks like, oops. So let's do some performance analysis. If I go back to my site, let me pull up, I'll pull up the before version of the site so you can see what kind of score that's going to get. And then we'll pull the same thing up in after. So here's my URL. I can go paste that into Firefox. And then I can use my Google page speed and I say I want to analyze the performance on this. I don't know why that's not doing what I want at the moment. Let's see if I can show this in the other window here. My new version of Firefox here, so see if we can get that to work again. So when I go against the before, I want to see how this guy actually looks. There we go. So what I can see is it's going to give me a quick score if I scored 78 out of 100 from Google PageSpeed's perspective. This is my website before, so I purposely don't have compression on. I'm not using caching. I'm not doing the minification. So you'll see it's complaining about these, and I can say, I don't know what this means about minifying JavaScript. I can actually click. I can go out and see, well, this is what it means. And they've got some links and some tools that you can use. But again, it's just giving me a nice quick measurement of, you know, what am I doing well, what am I doing poorly. If I go pull up the same thing for my after site, close out my Fiddler here in case it doesn't like that. Okay, Firefox blocks certain port numbers, and I've got that on another port, so I'm not going to be able to get this running at this instant. I've done this before, and what it'll do is it's more in the 90s. So I'll get back a speed of 90s. It'll notice that I've got the, if I go back to the report from the other one, it'll tell me I've got compression on, I'm minifying, I've got images that are optimized. So again, it's just a way for me to do a quick before and after of am I making the right performance improvements. And if you're just starting with performance, it's a really quick way to evaluate where am I at as far as a measurement for your site. The other tool I'll mention, I haven't used this yet, I've thought this would be interesting to try. Charles Proxy is a tool that you can buy that will simulate various connection speeds. So if you have to be able to show how would your browser and site behave if you're on a modem versus on a broadband at a certain speed, you can test out those scenarios using Charles Proxy. It'll just limit how it talks to the server so you can get a feeling for how it's going to perform in different connection speeds, which sounds kind of interesting. Got a list of a lot of other ideas. I'm running out of time here, so I won't be able to go through all of these. The one I'm kind of interested in personally, you can serve images. So if you know how browsers work, they go get your home page. They've got a series of back connections they can use. So most browsers will just say 3 for now. They have 3 back connections they can make to my server. So when they need JavaScript, CSS, and style sheets, they can go get 3 of them in parallel essentially. So we'll talk about images first. By having my images served from different domain names, so for instance, 3 images come from A.com and then I do B.com for the next 3, they'll do 3 connections per domain name, so I can get 6 images downloading in parallel rather than just 3. So that's an idea that I kind of want to look at. Again, a good resource, the High Performance Websites by Steve Sodders is an excellent book, walks through these techniques and ideas so you can have an idea of what should you do from a performance standpoint. I also liked website optimization. I gave you a link here for Google PageSpeed. I think that's worth using to get you a good feeling for where you're at for performance. So that's all I had. Again, Twitter handle, email address. I'm going to provide the code so you'll have the before and after versions of the website and all of these slides. And now we can open it up if people have any particular questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert. So we do have some questions. Let's see. You were talking about that Ajax minifier. Does this Ajax minifier combine the JS files to reduce the number of requests needed?
So Ajax minifier on its own only does the minification work. So all it does is it will take the white space comments, all that stuff out to do the minification. I used MS Build tasks. So if you go out to that ASP Alliance, let me pop back here to that. I'll pull up that particular slide. If you go out to aspalliance.com, 1992, it'll detail how this works, but I use MS Build tasks. That is what actually combines together all my JavaScript files. That's not something Ajax Minifier does on its own. That's an MS Build thing.
Okay, and from Matt, we've offloaded some stuff to CDNs on Amazon S3's cloud service. The problem we have is that PDF documents, for instance, get indexed in Google without our website name and instead a name like cdn1.amazons3.com instead of their domain. Any way to fix this?
Okay, so I guess the question is, and this is true for me as well, using a CDN for the images, I have to use a domain name. In my case, I get to pick one that at least is within my site, so it's a subdomain of mine. So for instance, if I'm a.com, I can use images.a.com. So at least it's branded towards my domain name. I'm not familiar with if Amazon is forcing you to use a particular domain name. In other words, it's all Amazon specific. I'm not aware of any trick you're going to be able to pull to make the that look differently. In other words, I would go back to Amazon and see, is there a way that I can either pay additional money, sometimes they do that, to allow me to use a subdomain for these off my main domain. You're still going to point it at their CDN. So this is what I actually do in production. Mine is images.a.com for instance. Actually, so it looks like it's coming from my site. I just point that DNS name out to our CDN provider to actually pull the images down. I'm not familiar, to be honest with you, on Amazon if that's an option that they'll give you or not. But
Okay, so the next question from Matt. I've heard in addition to the back button, there are issues with storing view states in session memory on the server when using Ajax callbacks, in that it will quickly use your entire history that was supposed to be used to accommodate the back browser button.
Okay, so yeah, so the question is, when I showed you that, for instance, how many of those will store view state? The way I'm making calls by using jQuery to a handler, ASHX requests back to my handler are not involved in the page lifecycle. So they're not involved in view state at all. And I'm doing that on purpose because I don't need view state on a callback to get JSON. If you're actually pointing and making Ajax calls back to an ASPX page, and you're doing that multiple times, then that would be true. I mean, every time you're making a callback to ASPX, it's going to run its normal page lifecycle and ching up another view state into your memory. So my suggestion would be, if you can, don't make a callback to a page, make a callback to a handler, because the handler won't be involved with view state and you won't have that issue.
Let's see. Is there any all-in-one framework for handling static resources, CSS, JS, like the Java project, I'm not sure how this is pronounced, JAR, J-A-W-R, with features like sprite generation, post processors, plugins for different compression libraries like Yahoo's YUI compressor, etc.?
I guess I have not personally found an all-in-one framework. You know, from an ASP.NET perspective, it certainly does not provide this all just check marks that you set on your project or your properties on your solution. That's not something built in today. Now they're starting to do the sprite work with, and they have the Ajax minifier tools. So I think they have all the pieces that they would be able to do that, but I have not seen them actually go through the work of saying, here, click all these things. I want compression, I want everything minimized, I want everything combined, and the ASP.NET framework taking care of that for you, I have never seen. I know that's not built into Visual Studio. I'm not sure if there are competitive products. I've heard of Chirpy, which is an ASP.NET. It does some handlers, it does some of this minification, it does some of the sprite stuff. I'm just not familiar with, there's nothing built into ASP.NET. And I don't personally, I haven't found a framework that does it all, so I've been doing them in piece by piece.
Let's see. I think we got that one.
Hey, Amanda, let me just add.
Yes.
No, go ahead. I'll let you finish. I wanted to make a point, and I'll come back to it about some of this points that he made about the framework. And I know we're speaking in general, but I wanted to make a point. But I'll come back to it. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, actually, well, this is a good time. That was the next question, or that was the next comment that I have is from Matt about that you commented about DevExpress ASP.NET controls. So.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, first of all, uh, this has been fantastic, Robert, and I think it helps explain a lot of things. The the first thing is, uh, I would say that performance is when you look at it from the design perspective, don't start thinking it from like, okay, am I going to be minifying this and et cetera, right? A lot of about performance should be a little bit of an afterthought in the sense that get your functionality working first, right? Now, the only point I wanted to make is I get a lot of these questions specific for DevExpress ASP.NET controls, and and I'll do a post wrap-up blog post about this excellent webinar, and I'll put some links for the DevExpress ASPX HTTP handler module that does a lot of things like this. So we've added support for CSS sprite images. We compress our callbacks, our view state, our HTML. So there's a lot of options that are available to you. Some of them are on by default. A couple of them are not, just in case you have any issues with particular browsers, because we are cross-browser compliant. So yes, Matt, I'll put some resources up so you guys can see a little bit more about this type of information specific to DevExpress.
And I'll reinforce, I mean, what you had just said, you do want to measure, and you don't want to, people call it pre-optimize. In other words, don't go nuts fixing a bunch of stuff you don't even know is the issue, right? From a high level, it's very likely if you have a modern site that you're going to have a lot of JavaScript, CSS. So most of the things we talked about at the very beginning are things that a major site's probably going to do. You're going to do minification, consolidation, you want to do image optimization. Once it starts getting into some of the coding things, you don't want to start worrying so much about performance. Like Mehul said, before you actually get the stuff running, you might be optimizing the part that makes no difference. And that's, the book really helped me with that, because I was really focusing on coding when I was doing performance, and that's not where most of the time is being spent, right? I mean, making all these requests and not having compression and expirations, that's what's taking the bulk of the time. Now that I have this taken care of, I can go measure and figure out where are my pages actually slow on the server side and optimize those.
Excellent point. And as they say, you cannot improve what you cannot measure. So
right.
First, get it down, and as you've got on your slide there, test after you do your performance things, so that way, that's your measurements right there, whether you need to improve or not.
Hey, Mehul, there is a question about, can the DevExpress handler one be used with our own pages? Do you see that?
I don't see that question, but it cannot. So the HTTP handler module, Robert can probably talk a little bit more about sort of the ASP.NET pipeline, but in essence, it sits in the ASP.NET pipeline. So when requests are made, and it's specific to DevExpress ASP.NET controls, right? Meaning that when we deliver our JavaScript files, we do things like combining script files so that way there's less requests and all that kind of good stuff. So it's really kind of tailor specific for DevExpress ASP.NET controls. I believe Microsoft has some things for at least things like, if you want to create your own CSS sprite images. I don't know, Robert, if you already covered some of that already in here or not.
Yeah, I talked briefly about that one. So in other words, when we talk about sprites, I didn't have it on the slide because I'm the type that, for my site, I'm going to be doing stuff that's released. So this is the technique I've been using. But for Microsoft, they have on Codeplex, I think it's called Image Optimization Preview 3. And it might say sprite in it. I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, they're specifically writing plumbing code for you to put on your web server that will do some of the sprite work for you on the fly, so that you can just, the idea from what I had heard was you have a folder that all the images in here I want to have be in a sprite. The first time a request comes in, it's going to figure out, oh, I need to sprite all of those. I'm going to change your runtime, you use different controls on the server, it will then use and reference their sprite image. And they've done smart things supposedly about caching and everything so that they're not doing this on every request. So I'm very interested in that going forward. I mean, once that gets released and I can run it through its paces and see how well it performs and how they do their caching, I think that has some nice opportunities around sprites.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only probably difficult thing for most devs would be to create the actual image map, since you're combining all the images and sort of CSS is picking from that one image, right?
Yeah, and so in this example, I guess the today world, you can have designers or ad agencies know how to make the images, but if you put them in a zip and drop them in that website I'm showing at the bottom, it'll actually give you back, here is the sprite image, and here's all the CSS you need to properly reference each image in the sprite. So it's still pretty easy. Yeah, it's still pretty easy to do.
Okay, yeah, excellent.
Hey, Robert, there's two more questions, but they're asking you to look at a website.
Okay.
About IIS plugins.
Okay.
One, I don't know if you can see, if you can maybe look at your questions to see if you can access those. Okay. Because they're asking about plugins like Google, and then the web page, and then Google for the Apache server. So I don't know.
Yeah, so basically they're asking about the, it's on Google's code site, and it's page speed, right?
Yep.
So is there something like that for the Apache server?
So I'm not familiar at all with Apache, I'm very much a Microsoft.NET guy. So I'm not familiar with top of my head what that. I'm trying to open my questions here and it's not staying open for me for some reason. If they want to, they can follow up. Probably the easiest would be if they want to email me. I'll put up my email address here again. If it's very Apache specific, I'll be honest with you, I likely won't know. If it's around more general client stuff, I may be able to help. So I've got my email address up there now. If they want to send me an email, I can follow up with them.
Awesome.
And just to answer Jan, most likely there probably are tools similar to this and approaches similar to this for the Apache. But my question is, why are you using Apache, man? You have ASP.NET. I kid. No, listen, we all have different needs. So Robert may know, but I'm sure if you just do some Googling, you'll find some performance-related tools for Apache server out there as well.
And the good news, the Google PageSpeed and all that is client-based, so that's going to work just fine.
Yeah. Awesome. So that is all the questions that we had. Robert?
Okay. Well, I guess that's all I had then, so thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Robert. It was fantastic.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert, for presenting and being here with us today. So DevExpress has a great lineup of webinars coming up through the month of May. You can register for them all at devexpress.com/webinars. We have two more this week, tomorrow, May 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, exploring ASP.NET charting, client-side development. The client code available in the extra charts allows a large amount of flexibility. In this webinar, we're going to explore some of what's available on the client side for ASP.NET charts, and that's with our charting evangelist, Brian Wood. And then May 5th, Thursday, we have an Ask DevExpress with our XAF Express App Frameworks team. Join us and ask any questions you have of the XAF team and get your answers. And that's what's coming up this week. All right, so again, if you'd like to watch this webinar later, it is downloadable and watchable at tv.devexpress.com, our DevExpress channel. Thank you again to Robert for joining us. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for choosing DevExpress.